According to Reuters and ABC News, President Donald Trump announced plans for a 25% tariff targeting countries trading with Iran, described by him as a final order, though enforcement details are not yet clear. Effective immediately, any country doing business with the Islamic Republic of Iran will pay a tariff of 25% on any and all business being done with America, Trump wrote on Truth Social. Then came the words that signal Washington's stated intent. This order is final and conclusive. The announcement represents what Trump frames as a dramatic escalation of economic pressure, not just against Tehran, but against its trading partners around the world. China, which receives 80 to 90% of Iranian crude oil exports, according to trade data, would face a stark choice under this policy: trade with Iran or trade with America without penalty. How the tariff will be implemented, its legal basis, and its practical enforcement mechanisms have not been detailed by the White House, according to reporting. The scope of Trump's announcement is sweeping in its stated intent. The tariff would apply to any and all business being done with America by countries that trade with Iran. The White House has not detailed exactly how doing business will be defined or how implementation will work. The message Trump appears to be sending is clear. Washington is demanding that the world choose sides. China is the apparent primary target. The lion's share of Iranian crude, 80 to 90% according to trade analysts, ends up in Chinese hands. These new tariffs, if implemented as described, could significantly impact Beijing's economy and complicate the already tense U.S.-China trade relationship. Brazil, Turkey, and Russia also conduct substantial business with Tehran. All could face potential economic consequences from Washington under this policy. China finds itself directly in Washington's crosshairs under this announced policy. According to trade data, Chinese refineries purchase the vast majority of Iranian crude oil exports, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the total. If Beijing continues these purchases and the tariff is implemented as described, Chinese goods entering the United States could face an additional 25% tariff. The economic impact would ripple through supply chains, potentially raising costs for American consumers while squeezing Chinese exporters. For China, this creates a difficult calculation. Iranian oil is typically sold at a discount compared to other sources. Losing access to this supply or paying penalties for maintaining it affects both energy security and economic competitiveness. Beijing has not yet responded publicly to Trump's announcement, but Chinese officials have consistently opposed what they characterize as American economic coercion through unilateral sanctions. Trump's tariff announcement follows a familiar pattern in his approach to foreign policy. The former business mogul has regularly used tariffs and economic pressure to achieve foreign policy goals. His approach has been characterized as maximum pressure, squeezing adversaries economically until they comply with American demands. Reuters and other outlets reported on U.S. actions regarding Venezuela's oil shipments, but the specifics regarding detention claims cannot be independently verified by international agencies. Trump has previously described a total and complete blockade targeting Venezuelan oil tankers. That combination of economic pressure and stated military readiness represents Trump's stated approach, according to analysts. Now, similar pressure is being announced against Iran and against any nation that maintains economic ties with Tehran. The economic announcement may be just the beginning. Trump is expected to be briefed Tuesday, January 13th, on specific options for dealing with the situation in Iran, according to White House officials. The briefing will reportedly include the Vice President and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with other national security advisors. Options under consideration reportedly range from diplomatic approaches to military strikes against security forces responsible for the crackdown on protesters. A White House official told Axios that Trump is leaning towards striking Iran to punish the regime for killing protesters, but has not yet made a final decision. The tariff announcement may be designed to set the stage for whatever comes next, according to analysts. The Axios report deserves careful attention. According to the outlet, a White House official said Trump is leaning toward military strikes against Iran, but emphasized that no final decision has been made. This represents significant reporting, if accurate. It suggests the administration is actively considering military action, not merely using threats as diplomatic leverage. The official's willingness to share this information with media may itself be strategic, a signal to Tehran that military options are genuinely on the table, according to analysts. or it may reflect internal deliberations that remain genuinely undecided. Either way, the report indicates that military action is being seriously considered at the highest levels of the American government, according to Axios. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt offered carefully calibrated messaging. Diplomacy is always the first option, Leavitt told reporters, but she made clear that other options remain available. Trump has shown that he's unafraid to use military options when he deems it necessary. Then came a significant revelation about back-channel communications. What you're hearing publicly from the Iranian regime is quite different from the messages the administration is receiving privately, Leavitt said. And I think the president has an interest in exploring those messages. The statement suggests diplomatic contacts are ongoing despite the public threats, and that Tehran may be seeking ways to de-escalate that it cannot acknowledge publicly. Diplomatic contacts have been confirmed. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff reportedly spoke with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi about the protests and possible revival of nuclear negotiations. Analysts see the contact as an Iranian attempt to de-escalate tensions, to find an off-ramp before the situation spirals toward military confrontation. Araghchi told Al Jazeera that Tehran was studying ideas put forward by Washington, but characterized these proposals as incompatible with U.S. threats. The diplomatic contradiction is significant. Iran is simultaneously studying American proposals and rejecting American threats. Washington is simultaneously threatening military action and exploring diplomatic channels. Both sides appear to want options beyond confrontation, even as they publicly posture for conflict, according to analysts. Foreign Minister Araghchi's response captures Iran's dilemma. Tehran cannot appear to negotiate under threat. That would signal weakness and potentially encourage further pressure. But Tehran also cannot ignore American proposals if they offer a path out of the current crisis. Araghchi's characterization that proposals are being studied but are incompatible with threats threads this needle. It keeps diplomatic doors open while rejecting the framing of negotiation under duress. For Washington, this creates its own calculation. Can threats and diplomacy work together, or does threatening military action while offering negotiations undermine both approaches? The administration appears to believe pressure and diplomacy can be complementary. Tehran appears to disagree, at least publicly. The human cost of the crisis continues to mount, according to monitoring groups. The human rights activist news agency known as HRANA reports more than 500 protesters have been killed by security forces since demonstrations began. More than 10,000 people have been arrested, according to the same organization. HRANA reports that demonstrators were shot with live ammunition and air guns, mainly from close range. Footage described by the organization shows dozens of body bags piled outside a coroner's office in the capital, with people forming queues to identify loved ones. These figures have not been independently verified due to an ongoing internet blackout that has severely restricted information flow from inside the country. The government has released no official casualty figures. Iran's government projects confidence despite the reported toll. Foreign Minister Araghchi said Monday that the situation has come under total control, offering no evidence to support the claim. The statement contradicts reports from rights groups describing ongoing protests and continued security operations. State media has broadcast images of pro-government rallies showing crowds chanting slogans in support of the system. These images are presented as evidence that the government retains popular support. Whether the situation is genuinely under control or whether the government is projecting confidence it does not feel remains unclear. The information environment makes independent assessment extremely difficult. The U.S. State Department has issued stark warnings to American citizens. The department has elevated its travel advisory to do not travel, urging Americans to depart Iran immediately by land to Armenia or Turkey. Protests across Iran are escalating, the official travel advice reads. Increased security measures, road closures, public transportation disruptions, and internet blockages are ongoing. Airlines have limited or canceled flights to and from Iran, with several suspending service until Friday, January 16th, according to the advisory. The warning also cites risks of arbitrary detention for American citizens, a concern that predates the current crisis but has intensified amid the crackdown. Trump's tariff announcement represents a particular approach to economic pressure. Traditional sanctions target the country directly, restricting its access to financial systems, freezing assets, prohibiting transactions. Secondary sanctions go further, penalizing third parties who do business with the sanctioned country. Trump's announced 25% tariff takes this logic to a new level if implemented as described. Rather than targeting specific transactions or entities, it would impose broad penalties on entire economies that maintain trade relationships with Iran. The approach would weaponize America's economic centrality. Because so much global trade flows through or with the United States, Washington could use access to American markets as leverage against virtually any country. Critics argue this approach amounts to economic coercion that violates principles of sovereign trade relations. China faces the starkest calculation under this announced policy. Beijing purchases the vast majority of Iranian oil exports. This trade relationship predates the current crisis and reflects long-standing Chinese energy needs and Iranian export requirements. The 25% tariff, if implemented, would create significant costs for maintaining this relationship. Chinese goods entering America would become substantially more expensive, potentially losing market share to competitors. But abandoning Iranian oil purchases would also carry costs. It would signal that American pressure can dictate Chinese trade policy. It would reduce energy supply options. It would weaken a strategic partner that China values for geopolitical reasons. Beijing may seek middle ground, reducing purchases without eliminating them entirely, or finding creative arrangements to minimize exposure to American penalties, according to trade analysts. China is not the only country potentially affected. Brazil, Turkey, and Russia all conduct significant business with Iran. All could face potential American tariffs on their trade with the United States under this announced policy. For Turkey, a NATO ally with complex relationships with both Washington and Tehran, the tariff creates particular difficulties. Ankara has historically maintained trade ties with Iran despite American pressure, citing economic necessity and regional relationships. For Russia, already under extensive Western sanctions, additional American tariffs may have limited practical impact. But the principle of American extraterritorial economic control remains contested. For Brazil, a major agricultural exporter to the United States, the potential tariff exposure is more significant and could affect calculations about Iran trade. The tariff announcement raises fundamental questions about economic sovereignty. Can the United States dictate who other nations may trade with? Does America's economic power give it the right to impose costs on third-party transactions? From Washington's perspective, the tariffs are framed as a legitimate tool to pressure a government it accuses of human rights abuses and regional destabilization. From the perspective of targeted trading partners, the tariffs represent economic coercion, using American market access as a weapon to override sovereign trade decisions, critics argue. The dispute reflects broader tensions about global economic governance. American dominance of financial systems and markets gives Washington extraordinary leverage. Whether that leverage should be used for foreign policy purposes and who gets to decide remains deeply contested. Iran has faced extensive sanctions for decades. The Islamic Republic has developed strategies for surviving economic pressure, alternative trading arrangements, sanctions evasion networks, domestic production of previously imported goods. This experience shapes how Tehran views Trump's new tariff threat. Previous maximum pressure campaigns have imposed significant economic costs, but have not achieved American policy objectives, according to Iranian officials. Iran's economy has suffered inflation, currency collapse, reduced living standards, but the government has not capitulated to American demands. The question is whether this latest escalation will produce different results, or whether it represents another turn in a cycle of pressure that Tehran has learned to endure. The domestic situation complicates all calculations. Protests erupted in December, triggered by soaring inflation and the collapse of the rial, direct consequences of economic pressure that sanctions have intensified, according to analysts. What began as economic grievances has expanded into broader demands for political change, according to reporting. For Washington, this creates both opportunity and complication. The protests demonstrate Iranian vulnerability to economic pressure, but they also show that such pressure falls most heavily on ordinary citizens, not government officials. For Tehran, the protests represent the most serious domestic challenge since 2009. Managing internal unrest while facing external threats requires careful calibration. For ordinary Iranians, the situation means being caught between government repression and foreign pressure, with diminishing economic prospects regardless of political outcomes. The military options Trump will be briefed on Tuesday reportedly include strikes against security forces. Such strikes would represent direct American military intervention in what Iran characterizes as an internal matter. They would target forces conducting what Washington calls a deadly crackdown on civilian protests. The operational questions are complex. Striking security forces would require identifying specific targets, avoiding civilian casualties, and managing escalation risks, according to military analysts. Iran has warned that American military facilities in Israel would become legitimate targets if Washington strikes. Any military action could trigger retaliation across the region. Iran is a larger country with more military capability than Venezuela. The risks would be correspondingly greater, according to analysts. The escalation risks are substantial. Economic pressure through tariffs could intensify trade tensions with China at a moment when U.S.-China relations are already strained. Military strikes could trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces in the region, against Israel, or through proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. A spiral of action and retaliation could produce a regional war that neither side initially intended. Even without military conflict, the economic disruption could affect global energy markets, supply chains, and financial systems. All parties have reasons to avoid the worst outcomes. But all parties also face pressures, domestic political considerations, credibility concerns, strategic calculations that push toward escalation. China faces a strategic dilemma beyond immediate trade calculations. Iran represents an important partner in China's broader strategy of building relationships outside American-dominated systems. The Belt and Road Initiative includes significant Iranian infrastructure. Energy security depends partly on diversified supply sources. If China yields to American tariff pressure and reduces Iran trade, it signals that Washington can dictate Chinese strategic relationships through economic coercion, analysts argue. If China maintains Iran trade despite tariffs, it accepts significant economic costs and potential further deterioration of U.S.-China relations. Beijing may calculate that resisting American pressure preserves long-term strategic flexibility, even if short-term costs are substantial. Or Beijing may calculate that economic pragmatism requires accommodation, saving confrontation for more vital interests. The crisis test claims about emerging multipolar alternatives to American dominance. China, Russia, Iran, and other nations have worked to build trading systems, payment mechanisms, and diplomatic frameworks outside American control. These alternatives remain incomplete, according to economists. The dollar remains dominant. American markets remain essential for many exporters. Washington's financial reach remains global. Trump's tariff announcement tests whether these alternatives can provide meaningful insulation from American pressure, or whether economic interdependence with America gives Washington effective veto power over global trade relationships. The outcome will shape calculations far beyond the current crisis. If American pressure succeeds, it reinforces patterns of dominance. If it fails, it accelerates movement toward alternative systems. Amid the threats, diplomatic contacts continue. The Witkoff-Araghchi conversation indicates channels remain open. Leavitt's reference to private messages differing from public statements suggests ongoing communication. Both sides may be looking for off-ramps, ways to de-escalate without appearing to back down. For Iran, reviving nuclear negotiations could provide a framework for broader discussions and potential sanctions relief. For Washington, diplomatic progress could justify stepping back from military options. But negotiations require both parties to believe the other is engaging in good faith. Threats and tariffs complicate that belief. Domestic political pressures on both sides limit flexibility. Whether diplomacy can outpace escalation remains the central uncertainty. Iran's leadership faces complex domestic calculations. Allowing protests to continue risks losing control. but harsh crackdowns risk triggering American military intervention. The government is attempting to project strength while acknowledging some grievances. Iraqi claims total control while security operations reportedly continue. Officials acknowledge some demands are justified while characterizing protesters as foreign agents. This dual messaging may reflect genuine internal debate about how to proceed, or it may represent coordinated strategy to maintain flexibility. The Supreme Leader's calculations ultimately determine the approach. At 86, Ayatollah Khamenei holds final authority over both military decisions and internal security policy. Trump also faces domestic political pressures. Having issued threats and drawn red lines, failing to act if the crackdown continues could be characterized as weakness by critics. His political base expects decisive action, not prolonged negotiation. But military action carries its own political risks. Americans are generally skeptical of new Middle Eastern military commitments. The consequences of strikes are unpredictable. The tariff announcement may serve multiple domestic purposes, demonstrating action, satisfying supporters who want pressure on Iran, while preserving flexibility on military options. Whether this approach can be sustained, whether economic pressure alone satisfies political demands for action, depends on how the situation evolves. The crisis plays out through competing narratives. Washington frames the situation as brave protesters seeking freedom against a brutal regime. Tariffs and potential military action are presented as support for human rights. Tehran frames the situation as foreign-backed destabilization. American pressure is presented as interference in sovereign affairs, with protests characterized as externally driven. Both narratives contain elements. Protesters have genuine grievances. External actors have interests in the outcome. Government forces have reportedly used significant force. Foreign pressure has intensified economic hardship. The information environment, with internet blackouts, competing state media, and limited independent verification, makes establishing ground truth extremely difficult. Lost in geopolitical calculations are ordinary people. Iranians face economic hardship intensified by sanctions. They face security forces responding to protests. They face uncertainty about what American action might mean for their daily lives. The tariff announcement will not directly affect most Iranians. They don't trade with America directly. But secondary effects ripple through economies. Reduced trade with China could affect Iranian exports and imports. Economic isolation deepens existing hardships. Protesters take enormous risks for uncertain outcomes. Those who stay home face the same economic pressures that drove others to the streets. Whatever happens in negotiations between governments, ordinary Iranians bear the costs of the confrontation. Several scenarios are possible in coming days. Tuesday's briefing could result in a decision toward military action or a decision to continue economic pressure while maintaining other options. Diplomatic contacts could produce a framework for de-escalation, or they could collapse amid mutual recriminations. The situation on the ground could stabilize as the government asserts control, or it could intensify as protesters persist despite the crackdown. China could yield to tariff pressure and reduce Iran trade, or it could resist escalating U.S.-China economic tensions. Each scenario leads to further uncertainties. The crisis is far from resolution. Every day brings developments that could shift the trajectory. The world watches a tense moment unfold. An American president has announced sweeping economic measures that could affect global trade. He is reportedly considering military options against a major regional power. He is receiving private diplomatic messages while issuing public threats. A government facing internal challenge projects control while conducting security operations. It explores diplomacy while rejecting pressure. It balances survival against escalation risks. Global powers calculate their positions. China weighs trade relationships against strategic partnerships. European allies watch American unilateralism. Russia considers implications for its own confrontation with Washington. Ordinary people in Iran, in affected trading nations around the world, wonder what comes next. The stakes extend far beyond Iran. This is about whether American economic power can dictate global trade relationships, whether tariffs targeting third parties become normalized tools of foreign policy, whether maximum pressure achieves objectives or generates backlash. And this is about whether military threats produce diplomatic progress or military conflict, whether stated red lines are enforced or prove to be negotiating positions. This is about ordinary people caught between forces they cannot control. Iranians in the streets, workers in factories affected by tariffs, families uncertain about what tomorrow brings. The coming days may determine trajectories that shape global dynamics for years. Trump has announced his opening move. How others respond, Tehran, Beijing, the international community, will determine what follows. The world watches and waits.